How to infiltrate the 1% and use their own fortunes to fund their destruction? Discover the chilling double life of Friedrich Engels, a man who spent his days drinking fine wine with industrial titans, only to spend his nights writing the blueprint for their downfall. Friedrich Engels was born on November 28, 1820, into a universe defined by a jarring, almost violent dichotomy that would fracture his psyche from the very moment of his first breath. Born in the Barmen district of Wuppertal, deep within the industrial heartland of the Prussian Rhine province, his very cradle was rocked by the relentless, deafening pulse of the textile mills, yet his soul was claimed by the severe, suffocating strictures of Calvinism. This region was colloquially known as the Wuppertal Zion, a formidable fortress of pietism where life was viewed through the narrow, unforgiving lens of sin, predestination, and eternal damnation. In this environment, guided by the fiery brimstone-laden sermons of local preachers like F.W. Kramacher at the Underbarmen Church, any enjoyment of worldly pleasures from theater to secular literature, and even the consumption of alcohol was viewed with deep suspicion and immediate spiritual censure. The environment itself physically reflected this duality. The Wupper River, once a pristine waterway, ran dark and foul, often stained distinct. Shades of purple or turkey red with the chemical dyes of the bleaching yards, a visual scar of industrial progress, that the young Friedrich observed with keen, critical and rebellious eyes from the window of his family's grand slate-roofed merchant home near the Brook Market. His father, Friedrich Engels Sr., was the absolute embodiment of this contradictory world. A wealthy, stern textile manufacturer who believed that material accumulation was a divine duty, ordained by God, yet simultaneously held that any spiritual deviation or intellectual questioning was a direct path to hellfire. Young Friedrich grew up in a gilded cage surrounded by the plush comforts of the rising Biedermeier bourgeoisie servants, fine mahogany furniture, and immense social status, but mentally imprisoned by a father who monitored his reading habits, his friendships, and even his private thoughts with paranoid vigilance. However, the father's attempt to mold a pious, obedient successor backfired spectacularly. Possessing a brilliant, restless mind that craved logic, art, and freedom, the teenage Engels began a secret intellectual rebellion that would eventually tear his family apart. While publicly attending church services and studying the basics of commerce at the gymnasium in Elberfeld, which he was forced to leave a year early in 1837 to enter the family business, he privately devoured the forbidden subversive literature of the Atheist Young Germany movement, particularly the works of Karl Gutzko and Heinrich Heine, and the radical romantic poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley. He immersed himself in the dense dialectical philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, using it as a sledgehammer to crack the foundations of his childhood faith. His surviving letters from this period, particularly those written to his beloved sister Marie, and his school friends like the Greber brothers, reveal a young man in the throes of an agonizing spiritual crisis. He drew caricatures of his teachers, mocked the local Philistines in his anonymous essays. Letters from Wuppertal, published in the Telegraph, Far Deutschland in 1839, under the pseudonym Friedrich Oswald, and dismantled his belief in the Bible and the dogma of predestination brick by brick. Eventually, he emerged from this chrysalis not just as an atheist, but as a fiery critic of the hypocrisy he saw in his own family, pious men who prayed devoutly on Sundays and ruthlessly exploited their workers on Mondays. This internal revolution was the crucible that forged his future. Before he ever met Marx, Engels had already declared a silent, lifelong war on his own class. In 1842, hoping to cure his son of his radical scribbling and settle him into the respectable, predictable life of a merchant, Friedrich Sr. sent the 22-year-old Engels to Manchester, England, to work at the Erman and Engels cotton mill in Weest, specifically the Victoria Mill, in which the Engels family held a significant share. It was intended to be a lesson in business discipline and bourgeois propriety. Instead, it became a masterclass in social horror. Manchester was the shock city of the Victorian age, the smoky, thumping heart of the Industrial Revolution, where the future was being forged in iron, steam, and cotton. But for Engels, it was a revelation of hell on earth.
Ow.
While his days were spent in the sanitized, well-ordered offices of the firm, checking ledgers and managing personnel under the hum of the gaslights, his nights were spent descending into the abyss. He did not merely observe the working class from the safety of a carriage. He plunged into the slums that polite society pretended did unexist, districts like Little Ireland near Oxford Road and the Old Town along the polluted River Irk. Here he described a scene of Dantean misery. The river was a black, bubbling mire of industrial waste and excrement. The air was thick with the acrid taste of coal, dust, and sulfur, and the streets were unpaved labyrinths of filth where the sun rarely penetrated the smog. He saw families of 10 packed into windowless, damp cellars, sleeping on piles of rotting straw alongside their pigs, their bodies wasted by typhus, scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, rickets, and starvation. He meticulously documented the brutality of a system that worked 6-year-old children to death for pennies, while factory owners built sprawling country mansions in the leafy suburbs. This visceral, traumatic experience culminated in his explosive book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1845. It was more than just a report. It was a prosecutorial indictment filled with empirical data, medical reports from the Manchester infirmaries citing the work of Dr. James K. in burning moral outrage, proving that the dazzling wealth of the British Empire was extracted directly from the blood and misery of the proletariat. Manchester taught Engels the lesson that would define Marxism, that the economic structure, the material conditions of life, was the puppet master of history, culture, and human fate. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. To survive in Manchester, while maintaining his sanity and his cover, Engels cultivated a sophisticated double life that would persist for decades. He became a master of social camouflage, a chameleon who could move seamlessly between two mutually exclusive worlds without losing his identity. By day, he played the role of the quintessential Victorian gentleman to perfection. He dressed in the finest tailored frock coats, joined the prestigious Albert Club and the Brasenose Club to smoke cigars and discuss cotton prices with the elite. Went fox hunting across the Cheshire countryside with the landed gentry, and charmed the wives of industrialists at lavish dinner parties with his wit and appreciation for fine wine, specifically Chateau Margaux and high-end clarets. He was efficient, polite, and ostensibly loyal to the capitalist class that employed him, even maintaining a cordial relationship with his partner Peter Ehrman, whom he privately distrusted and despised. Yet this was all a carefully constructed facade. The money he earned from exploiting the system was secretly funneled into the underground networks plotting to overthrow it, supporting Chartist leaders like Julian Harney and socialist agitators. Untroweled to this duality was Mary Burns, a fierce, illiterate Irish working-class woman who became his partner, lover, and guide. Mary was not a passive figure in his life. She was a radical in her own right, holding deep anti-British and anti-capitalist sentiments born of her own aggression as an Irish woman in England, and possibly connected to the Fenian movement. She unlocked the gates of the Manchester slums for Engels, vouching for him in rough taverns, in crowded tenements where a man of his class and dress would typically be viewed with suspicion or hostility. Their relationship itself was a revolutionary statement. They refused to marry, rejecting the bourgeois institution of marriage as a form of property contract. With Mary, Engels could shed the suffocating mask of the businessman and be his true self, living among the people he championed. Grounding his high-minded theories in the gritty human reality of working-class struggle, the trajectory of modern history shifted irrevocably in August 1844. When Engels stopped in Paris on his way back to Germany and met Karl Marx at the famous Café de la Régence, they had met briefly once before at the Rheinische Zeitung offices in Cologne in 1842. But that meeting had been cool and unproductive. This encounter was a collision of destinies that would spark a firestorm. Over 10 days of intense, wine-fueled conversation, interspersed with chess matches and heated debates amidst the thick tobacco smoke of the cafe, they realized they shared a nearly identical worldview. heavily influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach's materialism but pushing beyond it. However, history often gets the dynamic of this partnership wrong. Engels was not merely the junior partner or the acolyte at this stage. In many ways, he was the teacher. Marx was a towering intellect, a philosopher steeped in German idealism and French revolutionary theory. But he was abstract and disconnected from the physical machinery of the economy. He knew the concept of alienation, but he didn't know the price of raw cotton or the mechanics of a spinning jenny. Engels brought the empirical evidence to the table. He laid out the concrete realities of industrial capitalism, the actual operation of global markets, the physical condition of the proletariat that he had witnessed firsthand in the slums of Manchester. He provided the material facts that anchored Marx's philosophical soaring. It was Engels who convinced Marx that political economy, not just philosophy, was the key to unlocking the secrets of history. This meeting forged a partnership unique in the annals of thought, famously producing their first joint work, The Holy Family. Marx, the profound, slow-moving synthesizer of systems, and Engels, the quick, pragmatic observer of reality. They were opposites in temperament. Engels was orderly, athletic, tall, and practical. Marx was chaotic, sedentary, swarthy, and visionary, but together they formed a complete intellectual organism. The first major test of their collaboration came in 1847, when the League of the Just, a small clandestine group of radical artisans, commissioned them to draft a manifesto. The organization was rebranding itself as the Communist League, and they needed a clear, public statement of purpose to unite their fractured movement. The resulting document, the Communist Manifesto, is arguably the most influential political pamphlet in history. But its authorship is a story of collaboration, often overshadowed by Marx's immense fame. Engels had already written a draft titled The Principles of Communism, Grundsätze des Kommunismus, which laid out the core arguments in a structured, accessible Q&A format. When one reads the principles alongside the final manifesto, it is evident that Engels provided the architectural skeleton and the practical thrust of the arguments. Marx, notorious for his perfectionism and inability to meet deadlines, was stalling, paralyzed by his desire to make the text perfect. It was Engels who urged him to fuse their ideas into a single, punchy narrative as the revolutionary tensions of 1848 began to boil over in Europe, while the soaring, biblical prose regarding the specter haunting Europe and the sweeping historical materialism bears Marx's undeniable stamp. Engels' influence is stamped on the document's clarity, its accessibility, and its urgent call to action. He ensured that their complex theories were distilled into slogans that could be understood by the workers on the barricades, famously changing the League's motto from the gentle "all men are brothers" to the far more militant "workers of all lands unite." The manifesto was their joint declaration of war against the old order, a document that streamlined decades of economic theory into a weaponized text designed to topple governments. When the revolutions of 1848 finally erupted across Europe, engulfing France, Germany, and Italy in flames, Engels did not content himself with merely writing about them from a desk. He picked up a rifle and went to war. Unlike Marx, who fought primarily with his pen as an editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne, Engels rushed to the front lines of the conflict. In 1849, he joined the armed insurrection in Baden and the Palatinate, serving as an aide-de-camp in the Revolutionary Army under the command of August Willich, a former Prussian artillery officer turned revolutionary. This was no armchair generalship or safe rearguard duty. Engels was in the thick of the action, commanding artillery, and participating in 4 separate battles against the Prussian forces, including the intense engagements at Rastatt and Wagusel. He displayed a surprising aptitude for military strategy, ballistics, and logistics, earning the respect of professional soldiers who were unaware of his intellectual background. He witnessed the chaos of war, the incompetence of the disorganized revolutionary leadership, whom he bitterly criticized as petty bourgeois chatterboxes, and the brutal efficiency of the Prussian army that eventually crushed them. He was reportedly fearless under fire, finding a strange exhilaration in the whistling of bullets during the cannonade. This combat experience earned him the lifelong nickname "the General" among his socialist comrades. It also profoundly shaped Marx's theory on the state and violence. Engels understood viscerally that a revolution could not succeed on high ideals alone. it required discipline, organization, and a military strategy capable of defeating a professional army. The failure of the 1848 revolutions forced Marx and Engels into exile in England, marking the beginning of the most difficult and sacrificial period of Engels' life. The Marx family was destitute, living in squalor in London's Dean Street in Soho, pursued by creditors, Prussian spies, and plagued by constant illness. Marx, utterly incapable of managing finances and unwilling to take a regular job that would distract from his research, faced the real prospect of starvation for his wife Jenny and their children. In a tragedy that haunts the history of the movement, 3 of Marx's children, Guido, Franziska, and his beloved son Edgar, nicknamed Mush, died young, largely due to poverty and the squalid conditions of their exile. Engels, realizing that Marx possessed the greater theoretical mind necessary to write the definitive critique of capitalism, made a decision that borders on martyrdom. He returned to Manchester and the accursed commerce he loathed. He went back to the office at Ehrman and Engels, resuming his double life to secure a steady income. For 20 agonizing years, Engels endured the Egyptian bondage of the cotton trade. He hated every minute of it, complaining in private letters about the soul-crushing boredom of merchants and the hypocrisy of the business world. Yet he stayed, rising to become a partner solely to funnel his earnings to Marx in London. He frequently cut £5 notes in half, sending one half by mail and waiting for confirmation before sending the other. To prevent theft, a desperate measure to ensure the survival of his friend, he bought Marx the time, the paper, and the peace of mind to sit in the famous reading room of the British Museum and write Das Kapital. When they were together in Manchester, they would study at the famous alcove in Chetham's library. It's a spot that remains a historical landmark today, discussing economics while gazing out at the medieval buildings. Engels sacrificed his own prime intellectual years, accepting a life of commercial drudgery to sponsor the work of his friend. It was a daily act of devotion, a recognition that the cause was greater than his own happiness or ambition. But Engels' contribution during these years of silence was not limited to signing checks and balancing accounts. He was also the invisible intellectual engine that kept the Marx brand alive in the public eye. During the 1850s, Marx was employed as a European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, a vital source of income for the struggling family. However, Marx's English was initially rough, and he was often too overwhelmed by his deep economic studies or debilitating health issues. Painful boils, carbuncles, and liver trouble to meet his deadlines. Engels stepped into the breach. He ghostwrote dozens upon dozens of articles, detailed analysis of the Crimean War, the uprisings in India, military strategy, Pan-Slavism, and European geopolitics, which were sent to New York and published under Karl Marx's byline. One notable series, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, was attributed to Marx for decades before it was revealed to be entirely Engels' work. For years, American readers believed they were consuming the insights of Marx when they were actually reading the prose of Engels. This secret arrangement saved Marx's reputation as a journalist and kept the family afloat. Engels used his deep knowledge of military history and international affairs to produce high-quality content, never asking for credit, never complaining that his best work was being attributed to another man. It was a selfless collaboration that underscores Engels' total lack of ego when it came to the cause. He was content to be the silent partner, provided the movement continued to advance. The unbreakable bond between the two men was tested to its absolute limit in 1863, revealing the stark differences in their characters. Mary Burns, Engels' beloved partner of 20 years, the woman who had been his anchor in the hostile world of Manchester and his link to the proletariat, died suddenly of a heart attack. Engels was devastated, his world shattered. He wrote to Marx, his closest friend, expecting emotional support and shared grief. Marx's response was a shocking display of narcissism and insensitivity. He wrote a cursory sentence of condolence. She was very good-natured, and then immediately launched into a long, detailed tirade about his own financial woes, the butcher's bill, and his children's lack of shoes. Engels was deeply wounded. For the first time in their friendship, he froze Marx out. He waited several days before sending a reply that dripped with icy hurt. "You will find it natural that my own misfortune and your frosty view of it should make it positively impossible for me to reply to you earlier. All my friends, including Philistine acquaintances, have shown me more sympathy and friendship than I could have looked for. Double quotes. This letter terrified Marx, who realized he had pushed his only benefactor too far. He wrote back a humble, rare apology, admitting his callousness. The friendship survived, but the scar remained, illustrating the one-sided emotional labor of their relationship. Engels, the empathetic provider, and Marx, the self-absorbed genius. When Karl Marx died in 1883, the dynamic shifted once again. Engels was finally free from his business obligations, having retired with enough money to support himself and the Marx family. He moved to London and stepped out of the shadows to become the undisputed leader, the grand old man of the International Socialist movement. His home at 122 Regent's Park Road became the nerve center of European radicalism. On Sundays, his house was filled with visitors from all over the world: August Bebel, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Edward Bernstein, and Russian revolutionaries like Vera Zazula, drinking his wine and seeking his counsel in multiple languages. As Engels was a remarkable polyglot, he maintained a staggering correspondence, writing to socialist leaders in Germany, France, Austria. He was no longer just a partner. He was the executor of the legacy. He played a crucial role in the formation of the Second International in 1889, trying to keep a disparate coalition of anarchists, trade unionists, and parliamentary socialists united under the banner of scientific socialism. It was an exhausting role for an aging man, but Engels pursued it with the same discipline he had applied to the cotton trade, determined to ensure that the movement did not fracture or lose its revolutionary soul in the wake of Marx's death. During this time, he also lived with Lizzie Burns, Mary's sister, whom he married on her deathbed to give her social comfort, further cementing his tie to the Burns family and his lifelong rejection of bourgeois social norms. The most monumental task that fell to Engels in his final years was the completion of Das Kapital. The world tends to view Capital as a finished trilogy by Marx, but the reality is that only Volume 1 was published while Marx was alive. When Engels began to sort through Marx's papers after the funeral, he found a chaotic disaster. Volumes 2 and 3 existed only as disjointed manuscripts, piles of rough notes, indecipherable scribbles, and mathematical fragments scattered across decades of notebooks. The handwriting was crabbed and often impossible to read, stained with sugar and tobacco ash. Engels spent over a decade sacrificing his own eyesight and failing health to assemble this puzzle. He had to decipher Marx's atrocious scrawl, fill in missing logical links, restructure arguments regarding the value form, the transformation, its problem, and surplus value, and essentially co-author the texts to make them readable for the public. He acted as editor, interpreter, and polisher, making thousands of editorial decisions that shaped how the world understands Marxist economics today. Yet he refused to put his name on the cover. He published them as the work of Karl Marx, insisting he was merely the faithful scribe, clarifying the work of a genius. Historians now recognize that without Engels' immense intellectual labor, the latter volumes of Capital, which contain crucial theories on the rate of profit and capitalist crises, would never have existed. Despite the crushing burden of editing Marx's work, Engels found time to produce groundbreaking original theory in his twilight years. In 1884, he published The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, a work that remains a cornerstone of socialist feminist thought. Drawing on the anthropological research of Lewis Henry Morgan regarding the Iroquois people and Johann Jacobi Bauchofan's theory of mother right, Engels constructed a history of the family that was shocking for its Victorian audience. He argued that the nuclear family and female subordination were not natural or divinely ordained, but were historical constructs born out of the rise of private property. He famously declared that the husband in the bourgeois family represents the bourgeoisie, and the wife represents the proletariat. He posited that the world historical defeat of the female sex occurred when inheritance became patrilineal to protect accumulated wealth. By linking gender oppression directly to the economic system, Engels argued that true emancipation for women was impossible under capitalism. This work expanded the scope of Marxism beyond just the factory floor, engaging with the intimate sphere of the home and gender relations, and earning Engels a rightful place as a pioneer of feminist theory. As the Social Democratic Party SPD in Germany grew into a massive political force, Engels watched with a mixture of pride and alarm. He saw a new generation of Marxists who were turning their fluid, dialectical method into a rigid, mechanical dogma. In his final years, Engels wrote a series of urgent letters, notably to Conrad Schmidt and Joseph Bloch, in which he desperately tried to correct this dangerous trend. He warned against economic determinism, the idea that economics is the only factor that matters in history. He clarified that while the economic base is the ultimate determining factor in the last instance, other factors like politics, law, religion, and culture also play a significant role and react back upon the economy via a parallelogram of forces. He famously wrote, "Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it." He urged his followers to study history, not just repeat slogans, even critique the draft of the Erfurt program for its lack of democratic demands. Tragically, these nuanced warnings were largely ignored by the leaders who followed, paving the way for the stiff, authoritarian interpretations of Marxism that would come to dominate the Soviet era. By 1895, the general was fighting his last war, this time against terminal throat cancer. Unable to speak in his final days, he communicated by writing on a slate, yet he retained his humor and stoicism to the end. Even as he approached death, Engels remained consistent in his humility and his aversion to personality cults. He had seen how religion and hero worship could drug the masses, and he wanted no part of it. He left strict, explicit instructions. There was to be no public funeral, no grand procession through the streets of London, and absolutely no grave that could be turned into a shrine. He wanted to return to nature, not to be immortalized in stone. Upon his death on August 5, 1895, his body was cremated at Woking Crematorium, one of the first in England. A small group of his closest friends, including Marx's daughter Eleanor, her partner Edward Aveling, and Edward Bernstein, hired a boat and traveled to Beachy Head, a dramatic chalk cliff on the southern coast of England, a place Engels had loved for its wild beauty. There, amidst the wind and the crashing waves, they tossed the urn into the sea. Engels was gone, dissolved into the elements, leaving behind no physical monument, a final wish that was ironically betrayed by the 20th century communist regimes that would erect massive statues of him in town squares across the Eastern Bloc. In the final analysis, what do we measure the man who stood in the shadow of a giant? Friedrich Engels was far more than Marx's bulldog or a mere financier. He was the indispensable co-architect of an ideology that would divide the world. He was the man who brought the dirt of the factory floor to the ivory tower of philosophy. He was the pragmatist who understood that a revolution needs both a manifesto and a balance sheet. His life was a tapestry of contradictions. A capitalist who hated capitalism, fox hunter who fought for the workers, a brilliant theorist who happily played second fiddle. Without Engels, Marx would likely have been a forgotten footnote, a brilliant but obscure exile whose works were lost to time. Engels ensured that the machine ran, that the books were published, and that the movement survived. Yet his legacy is complicated by the very success of his efforts. His talent for systematizing and simplifying complex ideas inadvertently created the toolkit for the dogmatic and authoritarian regimes that followed. Friedrich Engels was the bridge between the dream of revolution and the hard reality of politics. A man who lived a double life so that the world could one day be made whole.